Hello and welcome to Dialogue, describing ties between the world's two biggest economies as at a crossroads. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Monday urged a non-conflict, non-confrontation relationship between China and the United States. So what has brought the China-US relationship to this stage? Where is the way forward? Joining me in the studio for the first part of the program, Arnar Tangen, our independent current affairs commentator, and Mr. Teng Jianqun. He's the director of the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. So, Foreign Minister Wang mentioned first, we must manage our own business as well between China and the U.S. What exactly does he mean by our own business for China and for America?
Actually, this is a very important occasion for the two countries to sit down to see their relations at this moment, because after at least 4 years ups and downs between the two sides, China and of course the United States should have a look at the recent development in the relationship between the two sides. We are approaching a new crossroad. We should take in-depth review on the recent development of the relationship between the two countries. And I think, as mentioned by State Counsellor or Foreign Minister Wang Yi during his speech this morning, he addressed at least 4 points, including mutual respect, dialogue, exchanges, and also some cooperations in various areas. So I think this is a good or a strong signal from the Chinese side. How can we maintain stable relations?
But do you think he's explicitly or implicitly suggesting that America hasn't been managing its own business well? For example, COVID and economic recovery.
Yeah, you're right. I think one reason for the U.S. now suffering such a severe pandemic is the policy adopted by former President Donald Trump. He didn't like the cooperation with the WHO, and he didn't like the cooperation between China and the United States. And he cut almost all the connection or exchanges with China and with international organizations. So this is one of the most important reasons for the United States to suffer such a pandemic. So I think such a pandemic, you should have comprehensive cooperation among all the countries in our world, because no individual country can deal with such a challenge. So this is very important for us. This is actually a lesson we should learn from the previous years.
And that is also bothering China-US relations, because the COVID response in America has always been criticized domestically, but the local politicians can always find a reason to scapegoat China for everything went wrong in America, and China's not pleased about that, obviously.
Well, why should they be? I mean, China's handled COVID-19 in a way that's remarkable, given the fact that the U.S. had more infections on, over 100,000 in one day, and almost as many deaths as China had through the whole period. It's hard to do it. Now, the level of irresponsibility is staggering, because by prolonging the pandemic like this, what they did is opened it up to new variants. And those variants are the ones that are now causing trouble. And this is not something that springs to life. This is something that the scientists know. This failure to follow science and instead follow politics has been an Achilles heel in the way that the U.S. has addressed not only this issue, but also trade.
But also the failure in COVID response in America made the relationship between China and the U.S. very testy, because Wang criticized Trump administration for looking only to fulfill their own needs, saying the approach between the two relationships has been veering from the normal track. Why is it not on the normal track?
Yeah, I think to some extent, some politicians like former President Trump and some congressmen manipulated the contradictions between China and the United States for their own sake. For example, for the presidential election in 2020. And they shaped the region, I mean the public, the ordinary people's region toward China because of the fast development of China. Of course, they gave some very negative impact on the attitude of the ordinary people in the United States toward China. So I think the politicians in the United States in recent at least 4 years just shaped or consolidated such a negative region toward China. And that's not for the sake of the American people, not for the sake of the Chinese people, only for some specific groups of interest, for example, the presidential election.
But do you believe that the Biden administration will change the tone of bilateral relationship and they can seriously meet each other and talk substantial issues?
There should be some changes by Biden's administration. If you look at the recent 1 month remarks or some words from President Biden or his cabinet members, you can see Biden administration would like to resume some dialogue and some cooperations with China. For example, the climate change, the fighting against the pandemic right now. So there are new tendencies for China and the United States to cooperate in some areas. This is not only for the sake of the Americans, but also for the Chinese people. So I think we should have a new starting point for the two countries to go ahead.
But the problem is, we presume that a democratic president is always more inclined to have ideological conflicts with China. This time, Wang Yi said China has been protecting people's democracy and human rights, but these track records have been criticized and blamed by Anthony Blinken and Sullivan and Biden himself. So do you think the two sides can tone down their rhetorics or even put that aside?
That might be a new area for the two countries to have a new confrontation. I mean, Biden administration has already gave a very clear-cut explanation on the ideology-oriented or so-called value-oriented diplomacy during his speech on February 4th. He mentioned or he addressed the importance of so-called democracy, human rights in the world, and the United States would like to promote such democracy or human rights in everywhere in the world. So I think this is a basic policy for Democratic Party and also for Biden's administration at this moment. I'm sure Taiwan issue, Xinjiang issue, Hong Kong issue, or some other issues in China would be the new, topics for President Biden and his cabinet members. We should be very prepared to deal with such challenge at this moment.
And what is your sense that Biden will be pragmatic, as many Chinese expect him to be?
I think he's boxed in. Remember, this is going to be the main issue. China is going to be the main political issue in both the midterms and the next presidential election. The only thing we know for certain is that over the next 3.5 years, China will continue to grow. The U.S., not so much. When that happens, Pompeo and his ilk will stand up and say, look, under the Democrats, we told you that they'd be soft on China and that China would go stronger. And that is going to be the refrain for them saying that we need back the White House, the Senate, and Congress.
So politically, it's still a lot of uncertain things for Biden. Well, thank you very much, Einar and Mr. Tong. And we will take a short break. In the second half of the program, we're talking about the COVID human challenge in the United Kingdom. Don't go away. Welcome back. Last Wednesday, Britain became the first country in the world to give the go-ahead for human challenge trials in which volunteers will be deliberately exposed to COVID-19 to advance research. Well, what is the thinking behind the trial? What are the dangers and controversies surrounding it? Why would someone volunteer to be given what so many are trying to avoid? To talk about those issues and more, Einar once again, and I'll also be joined from the United States, Dr. Megan Rainey, emergency physician from Brown University, and Dr. Peter Openshaw, professor of experimental medicine at the National Heart and Lung Institute of Imperial College London. So why don't we start with you, Peter? A scientific sense, why there is a need for a human challenge on COVID infection?
Okay, so these type of studies have been done for many years, particularly in the UK. In the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a facility set up on Salisbury Plain where many volunteers were invited to go on what was called a flu camp, or on a holiday where they would be inoculated with common cold agents. So the British public is used to the concept of those type of studies, and there's actually been an expanding use in the past few decades because of the enormous amount of information that you can gain by doing deliberate inoculation. So many of the scientific questions that we need to answer can be answered very directly by this type of experimental study. And we've been doing this with influenza and with other
Peter,
common cold viruses for a long time.
We already understand a lot about this new virus, and actually we have already several versions of vaccines against it. What kind of scientific data can we acquire by deliberately infecting people in a lab with the virus?
Yeah, well, the scientific knowledge, as you say, is immense. There's been a fantastic focus globally on trying to understand the science better, but it hasn't stopped by any means, although we do have some quite extraordinarily effective vaccines now. We believe that they're going to need to be adjusted because of the new variants that are arriving. And we also need to know a lot more about, the optimal schedule of vaccination, what exactly it is about these vaccines which is causing the protection, so that we can refine them and improve them. The vaccines that we now have are the first generation, but we think there are going to be, it's going to be necessary to have many subsequent generations, and also to find better ways to prevent disease in addition to vaccination and also to treat it. And all that can be done very directly by doing these challenge studies.
And Megan, I want to ask you, because there are already a lot of COVID patients in America, so from your experience of treating them and helping them with vaccinations, is knowledge not solid enough? We really have to purposefully infected people in a controlled environment?
That is the part of this study that gives me pause, and it's the reason that we haven't yet approved challenge studies here in the United States. When you approve a clinical trial, you have to consider the ethics of it. And there's two parts about challenge studies that give me a lot of pause. The first is whether the people that are getting infected can actually understand the risk. Now, in the UK, they're only going to be recruiting really healthy young people who are going to be lower risk for severe disease or infection. But we know that there's a small percentage of people who catch COVID, get sick, and have what we call long COVID or persistent symptoms, even if they're young and healthy. And as an ER doc, I can tell you that I've taken care of countless people who were young and healthy before they caught COVID and now have persistent symptoms. So that's the first part that gives me pause about this study. The second thing is whether or not the risk outweighs the benefit. We still have no great treatments for COVID, right? If someone gets sick and gets severely infected, I have pretty much the same stuff that I had back in March to try to get someone better. Remdesivir doesn't make much of a difference. Dexamethasone might help a little. Monoclonal antibodies may help, may not. But we're putting these people at a potentially high risk, and the question is, for what benefit? Yes, there are some big scientific questions to be answered, but is it worth the risk to those participants? Here in the US, so far, we've said no, it is not worth the risk.
Those are very important questions. Actually, those are the questions we've also collected from some social media users. They have voiced their concerns about the human challenge experiment to be conducted. Meg Schonchebig said, normally I'm all for ethical human challenge trials, but the problem with this one is I don't think informed consent is possible given how little we understand about long COVID. So informed. What exactly does informed mean? And Margaret O'Hara said, what does the participant information sheet say about the risks of long COVID? As Megan just said, we have enough data now to give risk estimates. Are they included? Do the participants know they are at the risk of significant damage to their health over a prolonged period? Will they get compensation? Peter, would you please answer those two questions? First of all, are they well informed enough about the risks they're about to take? And second, what if anything goes wrong? Who is going to pay for the consequences?
Okay. I mean, these have troubled us very greatly. And the reason that we've been delaying starting these trials is because of those concerns and because of our ongoing dialogue with the ethics committees. I mean, we are very, very carefully screening our volunteers to ensure that the risks are as low as possible. We do appreciate that the risks are not zero, and the participants appreciate that too. I mean, many of them by now have colleagues and friends who have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and they do have a good understanding of what the disease looks like in most people of their age who are at low risk. So we're screening them using a screening tool that really does exclude anyone who is at significant risk. It's the Q-COVID score, which was developed on a database of several million people in the UK who've been through COVID. So we've taken very, very stringent precautions to try to reduce the risk to the individual. In terms of how we explain the study, we've got an extensive subject information sheet that we go through individually with each person, and the aim during that explanation is not to persuade them to be involved, but to almost persuade them to say no if they have any doubts or concerns. And we do not only explain, but then have a set of questions that we ask them to check that they've understood the explanation fully. In terms of the indemnity, so Imperial College does actually indemnify the study. It's covered by insurance that covers other human volunteer challenge studies that we've been doing. And we do also have the backing of the government, so that if anything were to go above and beyond the insurance cover we have, then we do have that backup.
And you said it's a low-risk group, but that doesn't necessarily mean no risks at all. If a volunteer will suffer what we call the long-haul COVID, do they understand this is something they're going to live with for the rest of their lives?
Well, we don't know that yet, because long COVID hasn't been with us for very long periods. You know, this virus has only been circulating for a little over a year, and we don't know what will happen long term in terms of those symptoms. I mean, the threshold that we've chosen on the Q-COVID score is that we're expecting fewer than 1 in 5,000 people who are selected to be eligible for this study to be at risk of hospital admission. So this is people who are very low risk. I mean, the estimated risk of death that we explain to the volunteers is about 1 in 250,000. So again, we do explain that there is a risk of serious complications and even death, but these risks are very, very low indeed. And with the virus circulating and infecting so many people, the alternative to doing these studies is to more slowly accumulate knowledge in terms of the science that underpins it, the virology, the immunology, and potentially, therefore, the treatments. And our volunteers are quite altruistic and do understand that balance.
Megan, you're a scientist. If put ethics aside, do you think that kind of experiment will expedite the process of our knowledge gathering about this new virus?
So as a clinical trialist, it is challenging for me to put ethics aside, because that's part of how I design my studies. But if I were to set aside the concerns that I have about these studies, which there is a lot of debate over, There is great scientific knowledge to be gained. You know, I have debates every day with my colleagues about how much virus you need to be exposed to be infected, about the degree. We know that masks protect, but by how much? Exactly how the immunological response to the virus that causes COVID-19 progresses. So there are some really interesting scientific questions here. But you know what? There are a lot of interesting scientific questions that I don't have answers to, because the studies to answer them would not be ethical.
But the answers to those
one of the things
scientific
about ethics
questions
is that there's
will
sometimes
probably
not
save lives elsewhere. Isn't that the benefits of this experiment?
That is the benefit, and the UK has decided that the benefits outweigh the risks. One of the things about bioethics is that it is rarely black and white, right? You can come down on one side or another or somewhere in between. If it were easy, we wouldn't need the field of bioethics. And in the UK, it has been decided that for them, for their population, for their set of mores and values, this is ethical. Here in the United States, we have decided that it is at this point not.
Yeah, this is not a black and white question, and there probably will be a lot of unanswered questions, Peter. If that experiment, I presume, will solicit 90 to 100 people, if, God forbid, one volunteered, suffered severe consequences, or even died during this process, will the scientists sleep sound at night because you put them into such a situation?
I think we all feel very concerned about the risks to the volunteers. It is our primary concern, is to do this as safely as possible. And I should emphasize that the design of the study is only to escalate the dose sufficiently to start to see nasal replication. We're not aiming to actually cause any disease at all, and we're starting just with 10 infectious units, 10 viral particles in the first volunteers, which we don't think probably is enough to cause any infection. So we're going to escalate very gradually, and we're going to stick at a dose that we hope won't cause disease, but just the replication initially. So we are being extraordinarily cautious. Yeah.
Okay.
And the last thing we want is to see a severe consequence.
This trial is also undertaken voluntarily, but there are 45 pounds remuneration. So, Anar, I want your response to this. Why 45 pounds remuneration? Will that serve as a kind of a financial?
It's 4,500 pounds. Yeah.
4,500 pounds. 4,500 pounds. Will that become a financial incentive for some people to volunteer in this project?
Well, that's always a concern. I mean, you can say what you want about there's no fear, we took them through the program, but if it's 4,500 pounds and they don't have any, or they have bills that they have to pay, there is always that chance. And I wonder if they actually take a look at these people's bank accounts to make sure that they're not doing this out of medical necessity. When a society preys on those most vulnerable, that is wrong. That is an ethical challenge. I understand Peter's arguments about saying, well, you know, we want to answer questions and things like that, but I was a little taken back by when he said, well, after World War II, we had camps in which we gave people a cold and see what happened. This is not a cold, all right? And this is not a holiday camp. And this is not something where you should be making light of it. The British people may be used to it. It doesn't mean that it's any safer. The other thing that I have a problem with on the remuneration end is that if this stuff, you know, yields something, it's going to be seized on by companies that make this, but they're not going to share any profits with these people who are part of it. All right? They're simply going to put money in their pocket and claim that they have lots of expenses, and therefore they're entitled to all of the billions and billions of dollars they're going to make.
I think Peter needs to respond to those. Peter?
Yes, well, there's several really good points made there. I'm just wondering which to address first. I mean,
what about the financial remuneration first?
Yeah, so the level of compensation is set by the ethics committee. It's a balanced judgment about what is adequate to compensate the volunteers for their time and their trouble, but without being so much that it's regarded as being an inducement. And the payment of £4,500 is for a whole year of follow-up that will be performed.
Okay.
So a lot of that payment is not for the immediate study that is done, but in order to ensure that they come back and that their health is followed for a full year. So that is a fairly standard amount for this type of study. I mean, in terms of the severity, I mean, we are already doing trials of infecting volunteers with H1N1 influenza and H3N2 influenza, and there are also studies which have been approved for the use of human rhinovirus in people who are over the age of 65 and who have chronic bronchitis and asthma. And those sort of studies do carry a very significant risk as well, but have been deemed ethical by our independent ethics committee, over which we actually have no influence.
And Peter, how are the
ethical,
British people responding to such a challenge trial? Have you already recruited enough volunteers for this?
We've already had a lot of approaches from people who would like to be volunteers, and we're very carefully evaluating them to make sure that their motivations are, as far as we can discover, altruistic. So some of the volunteers are actually giving the money that they are being paid to a charity. I think there are many interesting motivations, one of which is actually a belief that it's more ethical to do human experimentation on a human pathogen than it is to subject animals to experimental infections when there is no consent and there is limited relevance to human disease. And I think the motivations for participating in these studies are usually very honorable, as far as we can discover.
But probably this motivation is understood differently in different contexts and different legal environments. Megan, I know that the debate is in America, but this kind of trial was also previously denied in Germany. Can you give us a sense why the debate on this is varied in different parts of the world?
You know, I think it's a few things. When you look at the basic precepts of bioethics, you're looking at kind of a balance between beneficence and justice and autonomy, and those have different definitions in different cultures. Here in the United States, we feel that the risk is greater than the benefit at this point in the epidemic, when our hospitals are still full of really sick people, and when we have effective vaccines. Now, our judgment is slightly different from that of Britain's. The UK has a different culture from the United States. And so I think that you're going to see some push and pull here. There is a reason that we have international declarations of human rights and guidance on ethical trials and medical studies. We have a long history, not just in the United States, but also worldwide, of inappropriate and unethical experimentation. And in Germany, certainly the experimentation during the Holocaust that the Nazis conducted with concentration camp residents has biased them to being much more careful. Similarly, in the United States, we have some really bad trials that we did back in the early parts of the 20th century, and I think that's why we're more careful.
We have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, NR. Wonderful insights. Thank you. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zoe in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.